Mr. Speaker, may I seek your consent and the general assent of members present to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 to remove the time limit in respect of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech.
I give my consent. Does the Leader of the House have the general assent of the honourable members present to so move? Aye. Leader, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 in respect of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech.
The question is, as moved by the Leader of the House, as many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. DPM.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I thank, in fact, all members who have spoken for supporting the single bill. You have also raised many suggestions, and even though Leader has just extended our time of the sitting, I think if I were to go on to every single one of your suggestions, we may be here way past midnight. So let me just cluster your suggestions around three broad questions. First, why is the government borrowing for nationally significant infrastructure? Second, is borrowing under Singer a prudent approach? And third, how would the government manage the debt issuance under the Singer? Now, before I address this question, I would like first to thank Mr. Liang Yinghua for laying out the principles and considerations clearly. Indeed, as Mr. Liang has rightfully pointed out, borrowing should be anchored by our overarching guiding values of prudence, discipline, and equity. And in fact, the key reason, as you pointed out, for borrowing is also about intergenerational equity, a point which Mr. Hun Hien Teck also made about intergenerational equity or redistributive justice. In fact, Professor Hun mentioned that, for example, on climate change, the building of dikes and polders and other structures for keeping our islands safe is also a responsibility to unborn generation for which the government is acting on their behalf. And what we are doing builds on what we have been doing in managing our reserves to make sure that while we draw on our NIRC for our recurrent spending, we are also leaving aside sums for the future generations so that they too can manage the long term. So this has been, in fact, the government's approach, which has been a very carefully calibrated one. So let me now go into some details. Today, we borrow under the Local Treasury Bills Act, the LTBA, and the Government Securities Act, or GSA, only for specific policy purposes, such as for market development, meeting the investment needs of CPF, and liquidity. In fact, the majority of our borrowings, about 71%, is made up of the Special Singapore Government Security, or SSGS, which are issued primarily to support the retirement needs of Singaporeans. Now, all these borrowings are invested and are not spent, and the returns on our investments are able to cover the borrowing costs over the long term. This includes the higher CPF interest rates that we give to CPF members for their monies in their CPF accounts. So we manage our borrowings carefully to ensure that we have the financial resources to repay our debts. While we use to borrow for spending in our development years, there has not been a need for us to do so since the 1990s because of strong growth and healthy revenues. Prudent management of our finances during these good years also helped us to build up our reserves. As Mr. Liang pointed out, we could therefore now count on our rainy day fund to mount a quick and decisive response to protect the lives and livelihoods of Singaporeans when the COVID-19 crisis hit last year. We did not have to incur a single cent of debt to fund our COVID-19 response. Now, our approach is different from other countries as our circumstances are different. As Ms. Fumiha reminded us, even during the COVID-19 crisis, some countries already had high levels of net government debt as they borrowed to fund recurrent needs. And some of these countries had to borrow even more to fund their COVID-19 response. For instance, the average net government debt amongst OECD countries rose from 65% of GDP in 2019 to 80% in 2020. By contrast, Singapore does not have any net debt. Singapore does not have any net debt. Now, this strong fiscal position puts us in a good position to emerge stronger from the COVID-19 crisis. So let me address why do we limit it to nationally significant infrastructure. This bill is a continuation of our careful and calibrated approach towards borrowing. And as mentioned in my earlier speech, we're anticipating a lump of development expenditure as we embark on a generational upgrade of nationally significant infrastructure to improve the lives of Singaporeans. Borrowing and capitalization of nationally significant infrastructure will help us spread out its lumpy costs to better match the timing of the benefits to the timing of the spending. And this is a fair and efficient approach. And this is a result of long-term planning. And we've been anticipating this need for quite some time now. I first announced that we are studying the option of borrowing for nationally significant infrastructure about 2 years ago in 2019. And I had also, at the outset of this of my speech, showed to you this infrastructure hump that we are facing. So, several members have made comments relating to about why 90 billion, why this, why not lower it, why not increase it, why the criteria, and so on. Now, let me remind all members that we're not talking about from tomorrow we are going to fund all development expenditure through borrowing. In fact, we are borrowing this $90 billion, or we are going to borrow this $90 billion in order to smooth out the funding needs because of this hump. And over and above that, our development expenditure will continue. Now, several members, including Mr. Liang, have also asked about what is the impact on our AAA credit rating. And several of you have pointed out that this is the first time that we are borrowing for spending since the 1990s. And it is not for a small sum. It is $90 billion. Now, MOF and MAS have in fact engaged the three major credit rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, to explain our approach on these borrowings. They too recognize that our approach is underpinned by key principles of prudence and sustainability. Even with the planned introduction of new borrowings to finance long-term major infrastructure, the credit rating agencies acknowledged that Singapore's fiscal position and credit rating remain strong. This is because they understand that the government is committed to a balanced budget framework and to fund recurrent spending with recurrent revenue. So having sound macro policies, fiscal, monetary, and structural, is paramount. As Ms. Fumiha reminded us, we cannot take our AAA rating for granted. We must be prudent in how much we borrow and what we use our borrowings for. So let me elaborate. One way we are exercising prudence is by limiting borrowing to infrastructure projects that have a total qualifying cost of at least $4 billion. Now, Mr. Edward Chia, Mr. Don Wee, and Mr. Xiao Chen asked about the government's consideration in setting the project cost threshold at $4 billion and if the government would review it in future. As explained earlier, the government is starting off more prudently by limiting the scope of the SINGA to larger projects that tend to have greater intergenerational benefits. Infrastructure projects are in most instances intended to provide a stream of services over many years, and a diverse set is needed for Singapore and many other countries. And as Mr. Donwee pointed out, Sports Hub itself, and whether it's Sports Hub or KPE, are all over $1 billion. So it is not our intent that all types of infrastructure will be funded by borrowing. Let me emphasize, it is not our intent to fund all types of infrastructure by borrowing. Why? Because borrowing is not revenue. It must eventually be repaid by future taxpayers. If we borrow for all infrastructure projects, even the smaller ones, we will leave our children to shoulder a bigger stream of debt repayments. This would not be prudent, especially in view of our maturing economy and slower growth rates. So the government will continue to plan for and build a range of infrastructure to meet the needs of our people. And such development expenditure will remain a part of our annual budget to be funded by the recurrent revenues that the government has to collect. So the 4 billion threshold captures major lumpy development needs that form the upcoming hum above our baseline development expenditure and are important to our national interests, as I've explained earlier on with this chart. Now, we are mindful that our infrastructure needs will evolve as our economy grows. Infrastructure costs may also grow with inflation. Hence, we are open to reviewing the $4 billion threshold in the future if necessary. Now, as to what should count as infrastructure, Professor James Lim and Mr. Louis Chua mentioned a few points, and I want to thank Mr. Murali Pillay for your thoughtful comments to these suggestions. Well, Associate Professor James explained his proposal to expand the scope of borrowing, so I take it that he's in full support of SINGA to fund large-scale infrastructure. But what he wants is an additional bit to further expand the scope of borrowing to include non-infrastructure spending. Now, let me sound a word of caution about the suggestions made by members to borrow for other non-infrastructure needs, such as education or healthcare. And I thank Mr. Derek Goh has just spoken for his warning that we should not dress all types of spending as soft infrastructure. In terms of spending on education, healthcare, the government recognizes the importance of spending on these needs. But we should always focus on how well we spend, not how much we spend. And we should always focus on the outcome of and effectiveness of our spending, not on how big a sum of money we spend. So we have made significant investments and ensure good outcomes. I've shown our effectiveness spending in education and health in this House before, and I hope that members will refer back to the Hansard and the charts that I've shown. And this has been internationally recognized, such as the World Bank Human Capital Index. Now, the second point is that Associate Professor James also cited several studies, about these are macro studies and may not apply to Singapore. Singapore has already achieved high levels of schooling, especially for our younger cohorts. Our university cohort participation rate is already at 42%, comparable to the advanced economies. More importantly, they have high employment and good outcomes. Mr. Louis Chua cited the recent US stimulus package and said, well, it included a whole range of spending on social infrastructure, and then he compared, with what we are spending, and suggested that actually we should be spending more. Actually, when we are looking at spending, we should be asking ourselves, what do we have to spend on? What has been achieved? And what other problems are we trying to fix? So both Associate Professor James and Mr. Louis Chua's comments point to the risk, in fact a very major risk, that if you don't draw clear lines every time an expenditure items come up for debate, you would then blur the lines, and the lines will keep getting blurrer. And you can argue that everything that a country needs to get itself working, would qualify. Just call it by some nice names and call it soft infrastructure. Isn't defense soft infrastructure? Isn't security soft infrastructure? Isn't guarding against cybersecurity soft infrastructure? What about healthcare, education, social spending to maintain social cohesion? And those so-called soft infrastructure too. So I think please be rigorous. Let's stick to what are factors, and rather than to keep blurring the arguments and keep blurring. If you want to have higher spending on healthcare, on education, say so. And we can debate whether are we spending enough or not enough. Now, there's one other very significant point which I would like everyone to bear in mind, is that in talking about all this spending, neither Associate Professor James Lim or Mr. Louis Chua addressed the question of who is going to pay for this borrowing. As I said, borrowing helps you to finance, but debt has to be repaid. somebody has to repay that. So the experience of borrowing for recurrent expenditure, and that the argument is that borrowing for recurrent expenditure will pay for itself because you will get higher returns on human capital versus infrastructure. But this has not been borne out anywhere in the world. Most developed countries that go into debt financing just end up with more debt. The hole is just getting bigger. And I want to remind members that we spend more than 30% of our expenditure each year in MOE and MOH, and that share is expected to rise. In fact, I'll talk more about this later. Now, so if we borrow for 1/3 of our recurrent spending, no matter how cost-effective they are, this would, over time, create a high debt burden for future generations. Now, I would also like to thank Professor Hun Hien Teck for pointing out very clearly that we need to have the capacity to raise revenue, and this is critical for fiscal sustainability. And indeed, the creditworthiness of Singapore, the extent of credit that people are willing to recognize for Singapore, the great Singapore, depends critically on whether they think that we have a sustainable fiscal policy. And that, again, depends on how willing the government is to maintain financial discipline and to raise taxes where it is necessary. And if we don't do that, what is likely to happen is that your credit ratings will fall, the risk premium will rise, and this is going to have an effect on the entire economy, on all, not just government borrowing, but on corporate borrowing, and in turn this is going to affect jobs of our people. Because if we make ourselves a less desirable place for investments, it will come back and haunt us. So Mr. Leong Man Wai's long speech boils down to actually one argument, that we have a lot of money, more than enough, because our reserves are large, and we can just spend and spend and spend. And then he comes up with some estimates of how big our reserves are. As I've said before in this Parliament, we do not comment on the size of our reserves for the reasons I have set out in my earlier speeches, so I shall not repeat this. Now, Mr. Leong Man Wai also conflated intergenerational equity for long-lived assets with intergenerational equity. So I mentioned that I would speak about the share of government financing for just national healthcare expenditure alone. It was 35% in 2011 and 46% in 2018, and likely to rise further. So an 11 percentage point increase in just 7 years. Now, Mr. Leong also claimed that the burden for paying various expenses came down to our workers. This is wrong. Let me just repeat what I said in Parliament again, that about half of our workers do not pay income tax. About half of workers do not pay income tax at all. So I hope that if Mr. Leong would like to make a contribution to policy making in this chamber, please be rigorous. Come here with fresh insights or new facts. Bring this to the House for debate. Please do not reread and reread your old script. Now, members have also asked if we can borrow for non-infra, Mr. Saktiandi asked if we can borrow during, say, a crisis. There is no one-size-fits-all to a crisis. We need to take into account the nature of a crisis and be prepared to use all the tools at our disposal. We are fortunate to have built our reserves, which serve, amongst others, as a rainy day fund, as Mr. Liang pointed out earlier, which we can tap on in times of crisis. And indeed, with the President's concurrence, up to $53.7 billion is expected to be drawn from our past reserves over FY 2020 and FY 2021 to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. Let me caution that the COVID-19 crisis is not behind us. If the global economic outlook worsens unexpectedly, we may have to take exceptional measures. If we have to draw on past reserves again to support our economy, we may consider raising cash by borrowing, and doing so would allow our assets to stay invested for the long term. But as I said, we'll be prepared to use all tools at our disposal, but we have to consider this carefully. Now, Mr. Lang Eng Ho also asked about the update on his suggestion, which he raised earlier during the budget debate, about other than Singa, should we be prepared to borrow to finance investments that allow Singapore to emerge stronger? Now, indeed, COVID-19 has accelerated structural changes in a global economy and has disrupted industries and reshaped jobs in significant ways. So we are fortunate that 5 years ago we started on our industry transformation. We have achieved results, and in the midst of the crisis, we set up the Emerging Stronger Task Force to look at how Singapore can emerge stronger from the crisis. The Emerging Stronger Task Force will be putting out its final reports soon, and we would then consider there are many good suggestions in the report about how we can build capacity in our companies, in our people, so that we can seize opportunities and emerge stronger. So I will study this report carefully and discuss with the Ministry of Finance later on how we can fund additional investments during this period. And this is an important opportunity for us to do so. But if we do borrow for this purpose of emerging stronger, we must set some conditions. Set safeguards, as Ms. Fumi-Ha reminded us. First, the use of this borrowing should be tightly circumscribed to our emerging stronger strategies. Clear lines need to be drawn. Second, we must ensure that this is a time-bound instrument, as any one-off special borrowing should be to meet the extraordinary circumstances arising from the COVID-19. It is not to become a recurrent fiscal tool, so let's stay disciplined. So we'll continue to monitor the economic and public health outlook closely and study this option carefully. Ultimately, COVID-19 is sui generis. Exceptional times requires exceptional measures, and it is in this context that I'm tabling this bill and to consider borrowing, if necessary, to emerge stronger from this generational crisis. So let me just sum up this section by warning that while we have many needs in our society, these needs are very important. We must ensure that we use recurrent sources to fund all these recurrent needs and not to get our future generations to pay for what we enjoy today, because this is not fair. And it is important that we must maintain this intergenerational equity. Now, let me just move on to warn that if we lose our reputation for being fiscally prudent, investor confidence will be affected, cost of funding for everyone, for governments and our corporates will rise, and this will spill over to the real economy. Now, Ms. Fumi-Ha and Mr. Louis Ng, Mr. Edward Chia, Ms. Mariam Jaafar have asked, about the checks and balances we need to put in place to ensure that the criteria for nationally significant infrastructure are met and borrowings are well used. So let me assure this House that there will be a rigorous multi-stage selection process to first identify potential single projects, which also involves third parties. And this includes an evaluation through the gateway process and a certification by each agency's accounting officer that the criteria in the SINGA are met. So let me elaborate. First, all development projects will have to go through the gateway process to ensure project worthiness and cost effectiveness before construction, no different from today. And under the gateway process, these projects will first undergo review by the Ministry of Finance, as well as the Development Projects Advisory Panel, or DPAP. The DPAP includes independent third parties, such as academics and industry practitioners with deep technical expertise. So they ensure that the project meets Singapore's needs, and not only today's needs, as Mr. Edward Chia reminded us, but also tomorrow's. They also ensure that cost estimates are rigorous and reasonable. And in fact, over the last few years, these processes have led to design improvements and generated savings of several $billion in total. Thereafter, these projects will be subject to further approval by the Ministerial Level Development Planning Committee. And finally, once these projects have been assessed to be meritorious, each agency's accounting officer, who is a senior civil servant, will be required to certify that the statutory criteria in SINGA is met, in particular, the $4 billion value project cost threshold and the 50 years useful life requirement prior to the raising of borrowings. Mr. Murali asked about the approval process, and so did Mr. Seah Chen, so did Mr. Louis Ng. And Mr. Seah Chen suggested that for prudence, perhaps we should reduce the total borrowing and reduce the interest costs. So let me reiterate that this is to meet this hump coming up in the coming 15 years. But I want to assure members that Parliament will continue to play an important role to ensure that our infrastructure investments are worthwhile. All infrastructure to be financed by borrowings will form part of our development expenditures to be approved through the annual budget process. Parliament may carefully scrutinize our proposed infrastructure plans before we proceed with spending and capitalizing the development expenditures. And any supply bill passed by Parliament has to be assented to by the elected President. Now, let me address some of the points raised by members on how the safeguards under SINGA ensure that the borrowing is prudent and sustainable for both current and future generations. So first, I'll address the limits on the amount of borrowings that can be raised. Before addressing the safeguards on the capitalization of nationally significant infrastructure, the SINGA has two key safeguards to limit the amount of borrowings raised. First, the $19 billion gross borrowing limit. So let me put the $90 billion in context. $90 billion is a sizable limit, as Mr. Seah Chen pointed out. It's equivalent to about 4 downtown lines, about 20% of our GDP in 2020 at current market prices. But nevertheless, 20% of GDP is lower than the previous borrowing limits under the 6th Development Loan Act, or DLA. They average around 40% of GDP in the year the DLA was introduced. It is also lower than the borrowing limits in other countries. For example, Canada, which also has good credit rating, has a recurrent debt ceiling of 1.17 trillion Canadian dollars, which is about 51% of the GDP. So when we compare with our own past experiences and those of other countries, a gross borrowing limit of $90 billion is prudent and sustainable and can meet our needs. So some members, including Mr. Don Wee, asked, why use an absolute limit of $90 billion instead, say, of rolling annual limits that is pegged to GDP, a percentage of GDP? Now, an absolute limit gives certainty to both current and future terms of government on the amount that they can borrow to spend on nationally significant infrastructure. Now, if we peg the limit to GDP, the limit will fluctuate as the size of the economy fluctuates over time. And this will mean a lower limit during an economic downturn like now, and constrain us from building critical infrastructure at a time when the conditions are right and could help to support the economy. When we consider nationally significant infrastructure, we must take a longer-term view. Nonetheless, I would like to assure members, including Mr. Edward Chia and Ms. Foo Mee Ha, Mr. Louis Chua, that this $90 billion limit has taken into account future economic growth and expected inflation on the underlying development expenditures. Now, on the annual effective interest cost threshold of $5 billion, Mr. Seah Chen and Mr. Don Wee asked about the considerations behind this threshold and whether it should be lower, given the low interest rates today. As I mentioned in my speech earlier, $5 billion caps our interest cost at around 1% of our GDP in 2020 at current market prices. So this keeps the level of our interest payments sustainable. And this is lower than the borrowing costs in other countries. For example, interest payment to GDP in the UK in financial year 2019-2020 is about 1.7%. Mr. Seah and Mr. Wee are right that in the current low interest rate environment, we do not expect interest costs to be near the $5 billion threshold, even if we borrow up to the full $90 billion. But the $5 billion cap provides some buffer when the interest rate cycle turns. And as several members have pointed out, interest rates at some point will rise. So we cannot expect interest rates to remain at current low levels forever. And don't forget that this borrowing is not for the next year. This borrowing is for the coming 15 years. So I hope this will address members' suggestion as to whether we should borrow more to take advantage of low interest rates. Now, let us remind ourselves that our own interest rates are especially subject to global interest rates volatility because our capital markets are open and monetary policy is centered on managing the exchange rate. And there were periods over the last 25 years of our history when our interest rates were much higher. For example, interest rates for 10-year SGS, Singapore Government Securities, reached 5.87% in 1998. So what will happen if interest rates rise? If we borrow too much from the onset, in particular for non-infrastructure expenditure, then we'll have a much higher debt ceiling burden when we need to refinance our existing debts. And our fiscal situation can spiral downward quickly. And this usually happens in a crisis when we can least afford it. But if we borrow prudently to finance only critical long-term infrastructure that brings significant benefits to Singapore, we can continue to ensure investor confidence even in a high interest rates environment. And this will enable us to retain our AAA credit rating, which can anchor our interest costs. And in addition, because we are borrowing for infrastructure where the payment structure typically stretches across time, borrowing costs under the single will be averaged out. So our prudent approach can therefore help us to maintain a strong fiscal position and continue borrowing to finance critical investments, even if the interest rate cycles turn upwards. The interest cost threshold will keep the overall debt servicing costs in check. Now, Mr. Edward Chia and Ms. Fumiha asked that in the event that we are nearing the interest cost threshold, do we need to raise revenues or divest our financial assets to raise liquidity to repay some of the outstanding borrowings so as to keep within the threshold? Now, first, the cap on interest is on the outstanding debt. And as we are ramping up infrastructure quite evenly over the next 10 to 15 years, the cap will not be binding as our initial spend is more limited. The next 5 years, we are likely to utilize less than $30 billion, but it is prudent that we size this cap early. Second, the cap is on the effective cost across all the outstanding debt. So if we issue bonds in the next few years, where rates are expected to be low, this will help to reduce the overall effective interest cost, even if rates go up in the future. Hence, the cap will likely be more binding when we are closer to the $90 billion gross borrowing limits, and if we are in a particularly high interest rate environment in the future. So this is precisely why, when we need this safeguard to ensure that the government will continue to exercise care in managing debt and debt servicing for future generations. Now, if interest cost rises beyond the threshold and we cannot borrow more, the government of the day can reconsider the threshold and debate in Parliament again. I should also clarify that for outstanding loans, the government can continue to maintain these borrowings until maturity and not have to repay the outstanding borrowings under the single immediately. Now, some members have also asked whether we should borrow the full $90 billion in advance, given the current low interest rates environment. And indeed, we are prepared to start borrowing for the infrastructure projects that have undergone the rigorous evaluation and review for which approval has been given for works to begin within the next few years. And this will enable us to benefit from the current low interest rates today and to better spread out the lumpy cost of our major infrastructure. But we will not borrow for infrastructure plans that have yet to undergo evaluation and are not firm. Interest cost is not the only consideration. We have to continue to scrutinize projects rigorously. And by pacing our borrowings, It will also enable our financial markets to invest in a regular and stable way. Ms. Fumi Ha and Mr. Edward Chia asked about the safeguards, besides limiting the amount of borrowings, the safeguards on the capitalization and depreciation of nationally significant infrastructure assets. We intend to depreciate the assets evenly via a straight line depreciation method, and this will ensure that each generation contributes an equal share towards the nationally significant infrastructure. As an additional safeguard for prudence, we intend to cap the depreciation period for the assets at either 50 or 70 years, rounded down from its useful life. This reduces the risk of future generations having to pay for an infrastructure that is becoming functionally obsolete towards the tail end of its useful life. In addition, Mr. Murali Pillai asked about potential abandonments of single projects after borrowings have been raised. I should first clarify that the government has already started borrowing for and the government has started borrowing for and constructing a project, it has no incentive to abandon any meritorious projects, because doing so comes with both tangible costs such as demolition costs that will be charged to the term of government that abandons the project, as well as intangible costs such as reputational costs. But as Mr. Murali Pillai pointed out, there may be other scenarios where projects may be abandoned. For instance, if there is a change of government, if the new government abandons a project, it would indeed have to pay for the abortive costs, including contracts that have been signed. A few months ago, the Malaysian government decided not to proceed with the HSR project and compensated Singapore for the abortive costs in line with our bilateral agreement. So indeed, there is always a risk that any infrastructure projects, not just the ones that are financed by single borrowings, may be aborted due to circumstances beyond the government's control. And this is where we have to do our best to put in place the measures to minimize the risk, and should this risk materialize, to have proper recourse and maintain investors' confidence in the ability of the Singapore government to manage the country's finance properly and observe the rule of law. Let me now address the points made by members, including Mr. Saktiandi Supaat, on how issuance will be managed, including green bonds. The Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, as the government's agent, will be issuing a new category of Singapore government securities, or SGS, under SINGA. It will be named SGS Infrastructure. To delineate this from the existing SGS issued under the GSA, we'll rename the SGS issued under the GSA as SGS Market Development. Both categories of SGS will rank pari passu and will be priced along the same yield curve. They will also be subject to the same tax and regulatory treatments and will be made available to both institutional and retail investors. Hence, investors would see both SGS Infrastructure and SGS Market Development as equivalent substitutes. To keep overall issuance costs well anchored, both categories of SGS will be managed holistically, as Mr. Supaat reminded us, pointed out. This ensures that the overall supply of the SGS will be calibrated to market demand. To assess the demand for SGS each year, MAS will consider the prevailing global and domestic financial and monetary conditions, feedback from investors, and the infrastructure spending needs under the SINGA. In a year when more SGS infrastructure need to be issued, MAS will accordingly reduce the issuance of SGS Market Development, assuming market demand is constant. Like SGS Market Development, SGS Infrastructure will be issued across a range of tenors. This will help to manage the overall borrowing costs across the entire yield curve. The tenors and the overall duration of SGS Infrastructure will be calibrated to account for demand from investors. When market conditions are supportive, MAS will tilt the tenors for SGS Infrastructure towards the longer dated tenors, given that borrowings are intended to finance infrastructure with long useful lives. Presently, the longest tenor for SGS is 30 years. We'll consider issuing beyond the 30-year tenor if there is strong market demand. Some members, such as Mr. Don Wee and Ms. Foo Mee Ha, also asked if we will consider issuing SGS denominated in foreign currency. We will not be issuing such SGS for a start. However, the Singha provides the flexibility to issue SGS denominated in foreign currency. Together with MAS, the government will work with the market to explore the possibilities of structuring borrowings differently over time, including SGS denominated in foreign currency, if there is demand. And should we issue such SGS in the future, we will carefully study the options to mitigate foreign exchange risks, as some members have pointed out. Now to Mr. Saktiandi Supat's, Mr. Louis Ng and Mr. Don Wee's query on green bonds, we will issue green SGS infrastructure for projects that meet the green criteria. As announced at Budget 2021, the government will take the lead in issuing green bonds on selected public infrastructure projects. These green bonds are an important enabler of the Singapore Green Plan 2030. This will serve as a reference for the domestic green bond market, deepen the market liquidity for green bonds, attract green investors, and anchor Singapore as a green finance hub. We will issue up to $19 billion of green bonds over the next 5 years for a start. This comprises borrowings by both the governments under the Singha as well as borrowings by the statutory boards. For SGS green SGS infrastructure issued under the Singha, we expect the first issuance from FY 2022 onwards. Preliminarily, second-party opinion providers, which are institutions with environmental expertise to provide independent opinions on green bond frameworks, have indicated that our MRT projects are likely to qualify for green issuances under the Singha, as electric passenger rail is the greenest mode of mass transportation. The government is working with the MAS and industry partners to establish our own green bond frameworks for green SGS infrastructure, taking reference from international standards as highlighted by Mr. Louis Ng. As we are only just starting out our green bond programs, we will not be stipulating a minimum percentage of green bonds under the Singha for now. Nonetheless, we thank Mr. Murali Pillai for his suggestion. As for green bonds issued by statutory boards, we expect the NEA to issue green bonds for the Tuas Nexus project. Mr. Louis Ng will be happy to know that the Tuas Nexus is one of the projects to help mitigate climate change. It maximizes energy and resource recovery in the solid waste and used water treatment processes, leading to carbon savings of more than 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually. So this is equivalent to taking 42,500 cars off the road. Mr. Saktiandi Supat and Ms. Foo Mee Ha also asked how borrowings under Singha will interact with existing borrowings by statutory boards. To reiterate, borrowings under the Singha will be used to finance an upcoming generational upgrade of infrastructure, which are large-scale projects which can cost up to tens of billions of dollars. While our statutory boards do currently borrow for infrastructure, it will be more capital efficient for such large-scale borrowings to be undertaken on government's balance sheet to optimize financing costs. Nonetheless, there's still a place for borrowings by statutory boards. We expect statutory boards to continue issuing bonds, including green bonds, to finance smaller-scale infrastructure that do not fall within the scope of the Singha. So let me sum up by situating borrowing under the Singha within our broader fiscal strategy, and in so doing, address members' questions about our fiscal approach. Our fiscal strategy must remain true to our core values of prudence and stewardship, but it must also be resilient and nimble to adapting to changing times. Hence, we have employed a differentiated fiscal strategy for different kinds of expenditure. For infrastructure needs, we will now employ borrowing as one of our financing strategies. And this is in addition to other financing strategies such as pre-saving in the Rail Infrastructure Fund and the Coastal and Flood Protection Fund. Where appropriate, we also consider ways to partner the private sector, as suggested by Mr. Don Wee and several others, to fund infrastructure such as electrical grid upgrades to support electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The SINGA allows us to borrow to finance nationally significant infrastructure in a prudent and disciplined way. The safeguards help to ensure that the cost of borrowing remains sustainable and that this cost can be met by overall revenues without constraining our ability to pay for future needs. Let me assure members of this House that our fiscal position remains strong with borrowing, even if the economic outlook takes a turn for the worse. We also continue to remain in a net asset position. The majority of the government borrowings will continue to be issued under the existing LTBA and GSA for non-spending purposes. As for recurrent spending, such as healthcare and social spending, it is more sustainable to meet these growing needs through revenue that we can collect on an ongoing basis, such as taxes. Borrowing is not revenue, let me repeat that, and must eventually be repaid by future taxpayers. Borrowing for recurrent spending will only mean they will end up with higher and higher debt levels. So therefore, there will still be a need to raise the GST rate to raise recurrent revenues for structural increases in healthcare and social spending as our population ages. Such recurrent spending is in addition to our nationally significant infrastructure needs, which we will be financing through borrowings under the SINGA. Without borrowings, we might have needed to raise taxes even more in the next few years to fund the large upfront cost of this infrastructure, as Ms. Fumiha highlighted. So borrowing helps us to spread the cost of infrastructure over generations and avoid steep increases in taxes over the coming years. So let me address the three specific questions that Ms. Fumiha raised. First, the details of how capitalization under SINGA will be allowed. I've mentioned that earlier on in my main speech. Second, does the $90 billion limit take into account upgrading and maintenance costs of the infrastructure over the lifetime of the infrastructure? Well, we will not be borrowing up for recurrent expenditure related to nationally significant infrastructure, such as cost of repair and maintenance. So this cost will be excluded from counting towards the $90 billion borrowing limits. Third, Ms. Fu asked to quantify the fiscal space created from this accounting treatment. What is the estimate of the amount of taxes that would have had to be raised to fund such long-term expenditure if these were made under current annual expense approach? And, and does that mean that, we would have more fiscal room? Now, I said in my main speech earlier on that borrowing under SINGA would, I quote, lower our annual average development expenditure over the next decade from around 5% of our GDP to 4.2% of our GDP after taking into account depreciation and borrowing costs. So in other words, on average, SINGA will create fiscal space of 0.8% of our GDP annually in the next decade after taking into account the depreciation and borrowing costs. And this is around $4 billion in current dollars. So put it another way, this is the amount of taxes we would have needed to raise had we not implemented the SINGA, or the amount of spending that we would have to cut or not spend on SINGA. So to conclude, Mr. Speaker, sir, as we emerge from COVID-19, we must continue to build a better Singapore for the future. But we must remain prudent, even as we do so, and maintain our strong fiscal position. And to quote Ms. Fu again, the debt we accumulate must not put unfair pressure on future generations. Borrowing for nationally significant infrastructure under the SINGA will help us achieve these goals and set Singapore up for future success. Thank you. Back to Ms.
Leong Man Wai.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. And I have 4 questions to clarify for the DPM. I'm very perturbed by his saying that I'm not contributing to this parliament. I don't take umbrage because I aim to be a gentleman, but I'm seriously perturbed. I think what I'm trying to do here is to complete the picture, because I think maybe because of the various commitment of government, some of the information that's coming out of this parliament is not complete. Let me ask 4 questions to complete the picture. 1, I asked the DPM, do you agree that this year fiscal resources amount to $128 billion? We don't care how you classify the resources into revenues, but you have $128 billion. $39 billion of NIR, $12 billion of land sales, and $77 billion of taxes. 2, while you refuse to announce the accurate figure for the reserves, but the government published government financial statements every year, and as of March 2020, the total financial assets reported on the financial statement was $1.35 trillion. Please confirm that. 3, you provided some figures to say that the middle-class Singaporeans are getting more from the government than the taxes they pay. One question I want to ask you is, why don't you go to your constituency and tell the constituents that please pay more taxes, you will get more from the government? Okay. Have you taken into consideration all the indirect taxes when you presented your conclusion? Okay. And 4th, for all the expenditures that the government is trying to incur, are you prepared to give a 20-year forecast of all the expenditures that are going to come? It is a very serious matter, you know. If we have that much resources, we almost have 7 to 8% of our GDP, okay, including when you take into consideration the land sales and the NIR we have. Every year we have about 7 to 8% of our GDP in this sort of resources. And you tell me that going forward our expenditures will still be more than this. Then we have to look at our expenditures very carefully. Those are the 4 questions. DPM, please.
Well, first, thank you, Mr. Mawai, for the question. Let me ask that you do not put words into my mouth. I did not say that you're not contributing to this parliament. I said that please be rigorous when you come to parliament and justify your position, right? Now, you asked 4 specific questions, so you should not be perturbed, nor should you take umbrage. First, on your question about, you quoted the figure of 128 billion and you quoted $38 billion of NIRC and 12 billion of land sales. Again, I said in this parliament, over and over again, please read the Hansard, that land sale proceeds are not to be used for recurrent spending. We have a reserve protection framework where land sales go into past reserves. Past reserves are then invested, and we have an elected presidency to ensure that the reserve protection framework is working as it should, right? Working properly. And as for NIRC, again, we do not, I've said it before, that we only take up to 50% of the NIRC, and we are already doing that. Right? It now constitutes 3% of GDP of our expenditure, huge amount, more than any single category of taxes, whether it's GST, personal income tax, or corporate income taxes. And we are only using 50% because it is our responsibility to put back the 50% for future generations so that as our needs grow. Now, if our parliamentarians have taken the approach that you have advocated, we will not even be debating this because we'll just be talking about how much debt to issue in order to fund. And my numbers which I've quoted on how the OECD, many of the OECD countries, the average is 80%, right, of the debt to GDP, and how that has increased further. So please look at your figures carefully. And second, you asked me to confirm whether reserves in the gross financial statements are correct. Well, the statements are prepared and are correct when we publish it. But whether this can be spent is a separate matter. Now, third, you said, the third question is, I made the claim that, ask me to go to my constituents and make the claim that the more taxes you pay, the more benefit you get. I don't know your logic because I didn't in any way say that the more taxes you pay, the more benefits you get. And you also asked specifically about indirect taxes. Again, since you entered Parliament in the various budget debates, you have been raising this. I've been answering as patiently as I can. I hope that this will be the last time that I will answer this. That you cannot see GST in isolation. You have to see GST in the context of the entire expenditure on our households and on what taxes they pay and what rebates that they get. And again, all my numbers, I stand by all the numbers I have used in my past parliamentary speeches. So please do your homework and check it out. And finally, you asked me, am I prepared to prepare a 20-year expenditure forecast of all that is to come? I am not, because just 2 years ago, I would not have predicted that we would have faced such a generational crisis that I had to go to the President to touch our past reserve, to unlock our past reserves for it to be used. And $53.7 billion is not a small sum. Okay? So any projection that anybody claim to have the foresight to project 20 years, I'll say, better don't trust that person. Even 5 years, I cannot tell you what exactly will happen. But for recurrent expenditure, we can project. We can project how much our healthcare costs will be going up because it is our responsibility to provide for that. We know globally what's the trend of how aging affects healthcare costs. And what we don't know is what new treatments will come out, how lifespan will continue to grow, what kind of new drugs, new treatments, approaches will come, and therefore how healthcare expenditure will rise. So even whatever numbers that Minister Gan Kim Yong and I have been working, we are always conscious that this represents, in a way, a lower limit, that we have to provide at least for that amount, which is why I have argued that we need to raise the GST from 7 to 9%. So please think about it carefully. And for you to argue that we're 78% of GDP equals to NRRC equals to land sales, your numbers are just completely off. So I hope that you take your parliamentary duty seriously and that you do your homework before you come and debate us on the numbers.
Mr. Leong, I've not called you yet.
Sorry, I have to interject because there was a lot of allegations.
Mr. Leong,
yes.
Wait till I call you. Mr. Leong Mawai, if you have fresh insights, please, thank you. I just called you, you can respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, I'm also speechless. Okay, all the numbers that I'm saying are backed by research. Okay, so what the DPM has said just now, can I confirm again that you agree? First, we have $128 billion of fiscal resources this year, but you define and you classify some of it in the revenue, some not in the revenue. So the government is doing that different classification from what we see as total resources available. Okay, so that I take
Mr.
it.
Leong, can I suggest we cover new grounds? I think whatever DPM has explained, he has explained. If you are holding to your position, you're free to do so, but if you can have new insights, we can move on.
No, Mr.
And not
Speaker,
repeat the same ground,
Mr.
please.
Speaker, that is very important. You know, what DPM is saying is whatever he say is facts. Whatever we present as an alternative view is something that can be brushed off. And I have to go back and do more homework and be more rigorous. That is, I don't want to take offense, something that I think that's not professional.
So you will have a position, you disagree with DPM, and we can recognize that.
Okay. Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So do you have new insights that you'd like to share with us in Parliament?
Okay.
Apart from going over the same ground.
DPM just now said that he could provide the recurring expenditures that's expected over the next 10 to 20 years. If I may request that he provide us with that so that we can scrutinize.
Mr. Leong, he replied as to how he wants to approach that. There's no point repeating the same question because you get the same answer.
But I'm asking for a commitment.
DPM has replied and said it's not able to provide you the projection for the next 20 years because it's hard to project what the future will be.
But he did say that the recurrent expenditures are possible. But some expenditures, like the COVID expenditure, there, of course, it's not predictable. But some are possible. So I'm requesting whether he can provide those that are possible. Okay, so that's all, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much for my indulgence. Thank you for allowing me.
Thank you. Would DPM like to respond to any of that?
Mr. Speaker, sir, thank you. Let me set on record what I said, and I hope that you are not insinuating that I was non-professional in my approach, because if you were that was so, I'm completely speechless. Now, when you asked whether I could provide projections for the next 20 years, and I warned that it is not possible to project over such a long term because there will always be contingent events like COVID-19. And we had gone through global financial crisis, Asian financial crisis, SARS. So crisis is a recurring feature of our life today. And for us to pretend that we have the foresight to see clearly what will happen in the future is just not right. What we can do to the best of our ability is to look at structural drivers that will drive certain expenditure, such as healthcare. And as I said, even then, in my very many meetings with Minister Gan Kim Yong, our health minister, we had gone through our projections over and over again, and the numbers keep changing because of the factors that I mentioned in my speech earlier. So I hope that you listen carefully and not just look into your phone, please. I'm speaking and you're just looking into your phone. I hope that you have the courtesy to at least listen when I am trying so hard to address you, even though I'm not obliged to stand up and answer.
Mr. Leong, if you like, DPM finish.
Can you let me continue? Yeah. Now, let me also want to make the important points of why I had to stand up to say this. It is not my classification or the ministry's finance classification that this constitutes revenue available for spending. This does not. We follow international standards. And this have been agreed. It follows the international standards set out by the IMF. And the IMF provides for a range of ways in which certain expenditures can be counted or not counted because the structures of governments in different countries are different. Some countries have different layers of government. They have state, they have national, they have state government, they have city government, and what constitutes public spending will all have to be aggregated properly in order to make useful comparison. And in Singapore's case, we have made it very clear, including during our IMF 4 consultations, that we abide by these standards. We've always taken the same standards and reported our numbers consistently as to what it can spend and what it cannot spend. So please do not confuse the public that the government arbitrarily decides on what can be spent and what cannot be spent. This is a very serious allegation, which I hope you take back.
Mr. Leong, why?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. DPM, I'd like to clarify again. I don't think the definition of NIR, the NIRC, all these are IMF definitions, Can you provide documentary proof on that?
Of course they are, Mr. Leong, of course they are not IMF definition, because which country in the world has NIRC?
Okay.
Tell me.
Okay. Then inside the budget and the financial statements, there is a table about total receipts and total receipt. And the total receipts inside there includes what we call cash flow. Okay? So if you use the cash flow, the budget deficit will also not be so big. So again, you are defining...
No, Mr. Leong, I do not want to waste members' time on this. Let me first say that it is the IMF does not stipulate that what is NRC, what constitutes NRC, etc. It has a set of clear principles as to what will constitute proper spending, all right, and what can be counted, what cannot be counted, and so on. And because we are in a net asset position, we're not in a net debt position, debt servicing costs and so on, as I said in my speech, instead of us using current revenue to pay for debt servicing incurred by earlier generations, we have been in an extremely fortunate situation that we inherited that legacy, that reserves from our forefathers. And I hope that every one of us in this house and in Singapore will abide by that principle, will understand that the need for us to remain prudent, that we are a tiny red dot with no natural resources and for which you are subject to the vagaries of the global economy. So we are an extremely open economy as well. So I will just end there, because if you have any further question, you can file a PQ and we will answer you.
So, Professor J. Muslim.
Thank you, Speaker. I have just two clarification questions that I hope will be a little tamer in nature. My first has to do with the purpose of investment. And a point was raised both by Member Supat as well as Minister Heng that we are already #1 globally on the Human Development Index. But of course, we are debating infrastructure borrowing. And our infrastructure ranking, incidentally, according to the World Economic Forum, is also #1. So the first clarification is, surely we don't invest only on the basis of the past or where we are now. Surely we want to invest for where we want to be. The second point that Minister Heng mentioned was that we shouldn't count all education and health expenditure as infrastructure. I entirely agree, and that's why I didn't just wave my hands and suggest some random expenditures in these areas. I specifically spent one whole page of my speech explaining specific conditions where human capital projects would actually qualify as soft infrastructure. Suggestions I made would all pay for themselves, and just as important, satisfy intergenerational equity, a point that has been repeatedly made in this House over the course of this debate. So I wonder whether the Minister will consider any form of soft infrastructure that satisfy clear conditions, or are these always going to be off the table? Thank you.
Well, I thank Associate Professor J. Muslim for your question. So first, on your point about, we are #1 in the World Human Development Index, and infra, we are also #1. So do we need to invest in infra? So the answer is, of course, yes, right? Because you supported the infra bill as well. But as to whether do we therefore need to invest further in human capital development, absolutely. And which is why I said that on healthcare, I had so many discussions with Minister Gan Kim Yong on the healthcare expenditure and why we need to continue to provide for healthcare expenditure. Whether you call it investments, whether you call it any other name, the fact is we do need to spend more on healthcare to take better care of our aging population. Are we continuing to spend on education? Absolutely. And when I was in MOE, we were already building on the investments that we made by previous education ministers, including SM Teo Chee Hean. And over the years, we have been adding to our investments in education. Just one data point, simple data point. We increased the cohort participation rate that's funded by government to 40%. We set up 2 new universities. And right now, we are also investing more in adult education, in skills future, and so on. So it is not as if that the government has stopped investing in education. So please remember that, as I said in my budget statements before, do not take every budget as a standalone budget. Every budget builds on past budgets, and therefore you have to look at the cumulative effects of all this spending, investments, and the outcomes that it has achieved. Now, on your second point about whether, would I ever consider any form of soft infra? Now, and you said that you have spent a whole page specifying the conditions under which they would qualify. Let me say that when I was education minister, I went to many, many countries to study the education system, to see what we should do. I look at the spending patterns of various countries. And one education minister, which I should not name, said to me that, why are you coming to study us? And I said, well, because you have great peaks of excellence. And they said, yes, but we have very deep valleys as well. And I said, no, we will study from best and look at how best we can learn. And we learn from each other. So, and I have seen so many proposals on why spending more in this area or that area would make a bigger impact. The fact is that you have to consider education holistically. It is not just what you spend on preschool or primary school or secondary school or university. Human development takes time, takes effort, takes consistent investment of time, effort, and energy by parents, by students. So to just simply think that we can achieve great outcomes by spending more money is just wrong. That it is important for us to be rigorous about it, make out the case as to which are the areas of education spending which are lacking, and what exactly would we do. And don't get into the wrong path, because I've also studied systems which had extremely high subsidies for students of at various levels. And again, one education minister told me, please do not make the mistake that we have made, which is assume that we spend more. When we spend more, we will get better results. We awfully regret that decision because now it is impossible for us to take back. So please have a care. And you are an associate professor of economics, finance. I think you would understand these arguments quite well. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Significant Infrastructure Government Loan Bill.
Committee stage, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 33 stand part of the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Significant Infrastructure Government Loan Bill.